Hello and welcome to Mac Gamecast episode 39. I'm Jon Casper as always, and with me is the eminent Casper. How are you, sir?
Woo! Back again.
All right.
Had an episode or two there where I wasn't here.
Yeah,
How dare I?
outrageous, in fact.
Yeah.
So this is going to be kind of, we didn't have Casper on for the immediate WWDC episode, but I know he has some thoughts and he has a lot of cool other things related to the game porting kit, and I think that's our primary focus today, as far as I know anyway. Mac gaming stuff.
There's that. I'd like to have a few comments landed on the Mac Pro as well. I know you guys talked about that last episode. There's a few things I'd like to add to that. And then I've also been playing a fair bit of Pathfinder Kingmaker lately, which is a game that exists on the Mac, native to Mac OS, and it doesn't have an Apple Silicon version, but it's a great game. So I also have thoughts on that if there's time for that, or maybe that's everything.
No, I actually would like you to bring that up because the same studio is making a 40K game, Rogue Trader, based on the same, D&D framework with like the complex dice rolls and stat interactions and everything.
That's cool. There's also a sequel to the Pathfinder game, Wrath of the Righteous.
Yes, Owlcat Studios, maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, much to my surprise, their beta of Rogue Trader has a Mac version, so we can talk about that.
Both of their previous Pathfinder games have Mac versions as well. The first one has a Linux version, the second one doesn't, but they kept Mac support. So,
kind of funny. And if you have any other WWDC comments you want to drop, like on the Apple Vision Pro or something, feel free as well.
Honestly, at this stage, I don't care that much about the headset. That's not to say I don't think it's cool. It is cool. But it's far away. It's expensive. It's not a product I'm willing to spend that much money on, even when it does come out. And even speaking as like a developer, there's nothing like that I have made or want to make that I feel like would be particularly enhanced in VR or AR. So at this point, it's just not really a product that's in my radar that much. Like, I think the technology is cool, and I'm invested in following along for the sake of the technology, but it's not a product that gets me riled up like the Mac is and excited to talk about it.
I agree. Yeah, it's more it's so cool. You just kind of want to check it out, keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on it.
I mean, if there's like a store that isn't outrageously far away from me that has one, I'm going to go and try one. Like, because it's cool technology. I'm a nerd. I want to try cool technology, but it's not something that's like as invested in as a Mac or something.
Right. Yeah, I'm hoping here like Best Buys carry a lot of Apple stuff. I don't know if they'll do demos. They demo consoles and some other odds and ends. So we'll have to see. It's funny, there's actually no official Apple stores in my state because we're quite small in Vermont. But there are a number of Apple authorized providers, like stores and providers.
That's how all of Denmark is as well.
Right. Mostly one called Small Dog here in Vermont, Small Dog Electronics. They have stores, I don't know, not all over, but relatively speaking, all over. Small state. So anyway, maybe they'll carry them too. I'll see. I'm probably roughly about a half-hour drive from one, maybe 30, 40 minutes. So I would also if there's some demos, I would go check those out.
Definitely.
Same thing. But it's mostly kind of your show today, so to speak, because, your comments, your thoughts, all this game testing you've been doing.
Well, then let's do the same thing you did last episode and take it sort of chronologically then. Because then the first thing I want to add points to is the Mac Pro situation. Because the Mac Pro, initially when it was announced at WWDC, I'll say it confused me a little bit. Because I've been involved in a lot of speculation about what the Mac Pro was going to be when it transitioned to Apple Silicon. And at no point did I, or anyone else that I noticed at least, speculate that the Mac Pro would be a Mac Studio with PCIe slots. Like, we all expected something more. Like an Extreme chip or Apple slots that you could slot in an M3 Ultra when that became a thing, or God knows what. But it is just a Mac Studio with PCIe slots. Same top RAM, you can't get that 1.5 terabyte RAM configuration and all that. And I'd say initially I was very disappointed by that. I since watched Daring Fireballs, the talk show with Greg Joswiak, with John Turnus, with Craig Federighi, and a guy I can't remember the first name of called Rockwell, who primarily worked on the Vision headset thing. And they made some good points about the Mac Pro that made me like reconsider my stance a little bit. Mainly the fact that, so I was concerned about the 1.5 terabytes of RAM more than anything, because I had accepted we're probably not going to get GPU expansion on this thing.
Right.
Just because of the architecture of Apple Silicon and the whole thing everyone's developing against this unified memory architecture on all of the other Macs. And there's just not enough market share in the Mac Pro that they're going to optimize different metal implementations for a PCIe-based GPU that goes over a much slower PCIe connection instead of being on die, right? So to really fit in with the applications that are going to be developed for macOS, it's pretty infeasible to have something that doesn't integrate with the unified memory architecture, like an external GPU. So they would have to figure some other way of doing that, and I just didn't see that being in the cards. But I did assume that there would be some way to figure out a large pool of memory through some kind of like tiered setup, where you still have super fast on-die memory, which would then top out at the 192 gigabytes or something. And then similar to how like a Fusion drive used to operate, but in a memory sense, where you have this super fast on-chip memory, and then you have system memory that would function in traditional sense, and the system could like utilize that as like the swap, but it was still memory, just extra fast, right? That was what I was expecting, but none of that. But anyway, what the Apple execs said that sort of made me feel maybe there's a justification for the whole move away from that kind of system was some workflows do require that ludicrous 1.5 terabytes of RAM or that sort of level. And those workflows correctly are not catered for anymore. It's just not a thing.
Right.
But instead, there's new workflows you can do with this system that you just couldn't before on any system, not just a Mac, but no system at all. Because the 192 gigabytes of RAM on Apple Silicon is not just for the CPU. It's for the whole SoC, which means you have nearly 192 gigabytes of VRAM. And there was no GPU prior to WWDC that could offer that in any system. No single GPU, at least.
Right.
Now, AMD did just basically announce an Instinct card with a 192 gigabyte of RAM for AI and high performance computing workloads and stuff. Ludicrously expensive as well. But that was sort of an interesting point that's something you can't do on any other machine, basically. I struggle to see like there being a very big market for this, given that the Mac Studio is so much cheaper. And the only difference is the PCIe slots, and you do have Thunderbolt on a Mac Studio, and those can go out to expansions, chassis as well with PCIe, but we'll see. In any case, I also do think that there is a decent chance, like a 50-50 chance, that the next iteration of the Mac Pro will still have an Extreme chip, or maybe, they'll just go. And now enough people have converted away from PCIe over to other solutions that we can just drop it. But whatever the outcome may be, I still think it's an interesting product category. It's just not as interesting as it used to be, given that the Mac Studio, if the reason you care about the Mac Pro is not because you have some, catalog of PCIe cards, but just because you want the big performance, the Mac Studio is the interesting product at this point.
Right.
Those were just some thoughts I wanted to throw into the Mac Pro discussion.
No, it's not really a new comment. Maybe I said it last time also, but I just thought it was funny that I think you and Sam, a while ago, could have even been last year, were like, oh, maybe they'll fuse some of the, chips together, like stack 2 together or 4 together or something. I believe you said that. And then they come out and we have this ultra fusion technology.
Yeah, but we talked about fusing together all the way before the Mac Studio was a thing.
Yes.
Regarding the M1 Ultra.
Yes.
And then we kept thinking about that regarding stacking more dies together with Ultra Fusion to produce this sort of extreme tier chip with 4 M1 Max dies effectively instead of just 2. Now, if you look at, like, there was no way that was going to happen on the M2 or the M1, because if you look at the actual die of an M1, it only has the Ultra Fusion connector on one side, and you connect two of them, and now you don't have any more connectors.
Right.
So it would have to be like a new generation of chip that would support that. But yeah,
sure, maybe M3 or something.
Yeah, so it's possible that the Mac Pro as it is right now was basically Apple going, we need to finish the transition. We don't have M3 that can perform this extreme thing yet. Let's knock this out of the door and we'll cross the other bridge when we get to it or something. I don't know.
Right.
It is at least a bit of a shame that you know, when an M3 Ultra, M4 Ultra, M5 Ultra comes along, you can't swap it into the Mac Pro. So it's not going to have the same longevity as prior Mac Pros with upgradability down the road. It is more expandable than upgradable, which I think Sam said as well. But yeah, it's it is what it is. Now, there was that game porting toolkit. And I was very surprised by this.
Just to interject, I wanted to talk more about it in the show because it was actually the most exciting thing to me. But since it was just announced and I didn't try it and there wasn't any like data on it, I'm like, well, how much can we talk about it beyond like, this seems really cool and the potential of it's amazing. And then when you deep dive it and you've been, you know, doing it all week on Discord, I'm like, holy moly, this is amazing. You know, this is the potential I wished, you know, I was hoping to see and even far exceeded my expectations. So sorry, not trying to steal your thunder. I'm so excited you did all that. You've got me excited. You've got Ted excited. The possible PC heretics, you know, were like, hey, Mac gaming. Oh my goodness, you know. So
it is a very impressive development, especially given that it's not that many episodes you and I were talking about how code weavers have been trying to get DirectX 12 support for quite a while, and they've only just gotten their first game running. And then completely out of left field, Apple's just like, DirectX 12 just runs. We've got almost full support of DirectX 12. There are some things that they themselves say, if you're using this DirectX 12 feature, turn it off before and make a build, and then it can run, but don't use that. It won't work and stuff, right? But it's very feature-rich compared to the other DirectX 12 solution on the market right now for Metal. It's extremely exciting, and Apple is really pushing. Like, I was optimistic about Apple's push into gaming, but I didn't expect it to be this strong. It's very strong. Like, one thing is, you know, there was a decent public-facing push for gaming at the WWDC keynote. But even in every single session after that, there's been some push towards it, right? The State of the Union, which is the equivalent of the keynote, but a bit more developer focused, where it's more like, we've shown the public these things, now we're going to talk more about what you need to know as a developer about all these new things. That was also like had a decently sized section about gaming. And then on the Tuesday of WWDC, there was a 3-part series of Bring Your Game to Mac with just a bunch of information for targeting game developers, going, this is how you do this bit, do this bit, do this bit, your game runs. And including like an optimization stage and stuff. This game porting toolkit, I also want to emphasize that it's more than just one thing. Like, the thing we're focusing on mostly now, you and me, but also like the wider Mac gaming community, is just stage 1 of the Mac porting toolkit. It's what Apple dubs the emulation layer, which I find kind of funny, given that they are using parts of Wine, and Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. It's just a bit fun. But that's just step 1, the emulation layer. You know, the idea is game developers will use the emulation layer to run their game as is, no changes, and go like, oh, wow, even through all this translation, I'm getting 20, 30, 40 frames per second, whatever. And then Apple has provided a host of other tools that'll make it easier, faster, and, you know, more convenient for developers to port their games to Mac. And they can do these things piecemeal. So they can use the Metal shader converter to take the DirectX 12 source files and output Metal files. And then change some CPU code around to use Metal instead, and don't need to do all the work at once. You can do a bit of the work, run it again, and hey, now it's 10 frames per second better, and then you do the next step and improves. So I want to emphasize that the toolkit is way more than just it can run the games. It's an entire solution for helping developers get their games to run better, including Windows tooling, to help developers who primarily make games on Windows also have a better experience creating the Mac ports from their Windows machines without needing to go to a Mac as frequently to produce the binaries.
Right. That's important. I think we've either
definitely
talked some in the past or even like on the sort of the 1.0 version of the show, like 10 years ago, talking to some devs and some like indie devs who did porting, and some of them were just like, I just don't have a Mac laying around to test the game on. Yeah. It's kind of that simple, and they're not like swimming in thousands of dollars to just buy a Mac or whatever, but like a kind of a medium range Mac that maybe the game would run on. So I think that's actually, it sounds small, but I think it's a very key point what you just said.
It is. I'll point out that you do still need a Mac for final distribution, assembly of the binary, testing purposes. Like the game is a different version when running on a Mac, so you do need a different test suite for the Mac, right. QA and everything. Support might be still a cost you have, right? Because you do need to support a Mac version if you release a Mac version. So there are still extra costs associated with bringing a game to Mac that hopefully you recoup through sales, right? But yeah, you can't do everything from Windows, but it does help developers who run their machines on Windows be able to iterate faster without going to the Mac as frequently. They can push out the binary from their Windows development machine, and then someone else on the Mac side can test it without that back and forth as much.
Right.
But the emulation layer is the bit that we as end users shouldn't, but can use without any developer intervention already. I say shouldn't because A, it requires a lot of very early stage beta software right now, and I would not advise anyone who isn't, let's say, an expert tinkerer, just go out and try and install all of this and do it at this point. Because you're going to have to install macOS Sonoma, and it's beta 1 at this point. Back when Ventura was the new kid on the block, when I installed beta 1 on my iMac, I wound up in a position where I could boot my computer, it would stay on for 5 minutes, then it would kill itself, just completely shut off. And this would happen like consistently. I had to reinstall Monterey through recovery. There was no way around it, right? Developer betas are developers betas for a reason. They are not stable software. So yeah, I just disclaimer, I don't want people just going like, God, this is so exciting, I'm going to rush out and install all of this now. It's very early stages. It's very unstable software. That said, it is also less unstable than prior years. Like this is the most stable I think any developer beta 1 has been for me with Sonoma.
Nice.
And it runs fast, smooth, everything's great. That's not to say there aren't bugs. There are plenty, but fewer than normal for the developer beta 1s.
Solid.
Yeah, the developer toolkit also beta 1 that could improve greatly over time as well. And second, the intended use case for this is to help developers port their games to Mac. We, as the Mac gaming community, want to make excitement around all of this. Go like, look how well these titles already run without any work done. But this is by no means the ceiling of what can be achieved. Like a 2, even 3x performance increase with a native port for some games is feasible. And like, it's not a good UX experience for customers to go through this route. It is definitely intended for something developers use. It's not to say you can't use it. And if you're really excited about a specific game that runs on the toolkit, I think you should try when it's no longer beta software, or if you're really a tinkerer, maybe even now. But it is not the end goal of it. I want to emphasize that point as well. Now, with that said, I have been tinkering a lot and trying a whole bunch of games. And obviously some run better than others. Generally, I'd say that DirectX 12 games run significantly better than DX 1011 games. And don't think about DX 9 and earlier, because Apple hasn't done anything special with that. Their D3D Metal library only covers DirectX 10, 11, and 12, the graphics frameworks on modern-ish versions of Windows. For prior versions of DirectX, you're basically back to Wine 3D and Vulkan solutions that crossover and Wine already have out there, so there's nothing new there. But if we look at DirectX 12, like I have God of War running on my M1 Max. It's the 24-core 16-inch machine. God of War runs very consistently at around 30 frames per second on original settings, non-Retina native. So when I say non-Retina native, I mean half resolution on both axes. Pretty much consistently at 30 FPS. Console level experience, I'd say, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't really ever drop below. I mean, sometimes it goes to like 28 frames per second, but it doesn't noticeably drop, right?
Yeah.
But it also never really soars above the 30-ish mark. I'd say the range is like 28 to 34, which is very consistent, and I do think frame pacing matters significantly more than frame rate. Like, it's much better to have a game that stays locked at 30 than one that fluctuates between 120 FPS down to 4 every 5 seconds, right? So yeah, that's the level we're looking at for God of War, and I don't think it matters much if you have the 24 or the 32 core GPU here, because I found it seemed a lot of the time we were equally bound by GPU and CPU on my machine. The percent time on the CPU pretty much always matched exactly the percent time on the GPU. So if you have a faster GPU, it's just going to spend more time waiting on the CPU. And that's a factor of all of this translation being done, right? So that would be different on a native port, but for now, I don't think there's really any noticeable difference between 24 and 32 core GPUs. All of this is detail Apple gives you when you run the emulation layer. They have the Metal Performance HUD. I also tested in DirectX 12 games, what's it called? Cyberpunk. Where, again, a very similar experience to God of War, honestly. Like, I put everything to high, and there didn't really seem to be a noticeable difference between putting everything at high, medium, or low. Again, I think this is a factor of CPU bound versus GPU bound, because raising these settings put more load on the GPU versus the CPU, but if we're all just CPU bound, it doesn't really matter that much. But again, well, I was looking at like a bit above 30 FPS there, like I would say 35 to 40. So very playable. And again, like a little better than a console experience, probably, like depending on how you set the console tuning. 'Cause with everything in high, it would like be the quality mode of the console, but that runs at 30. What other DirectX 12 games were there I tested? Because I know there was at least one more.
Some sort of, I don't know if it's a Final Fantasy game or like a Dragon Ball game or something.
There's a both DirectX 11, but yeah, so let's just broaden the scope, I guess.
Elden Ring, I think you also tested it.
Elden Ring, that's DX12. I tested Elden Ring. That ran even better than Cyberpunk and God of War. Again, seemed to mostly be CPU bound, varied a bit, depending on area and stuff. But in the area I tested, which was the area around the first major boss of the game, what's his name? Market. Yes. There's both a Market and a Margot in the game.
Oh dear, that's confusing.
Yeah. And some people think it's the same guy. It might be the same guy. I don't know. It's weird. But that's just where I happened to have my save game. I'd finished him a long time ago, but I went back there for some reason. Anyway, looked at like 45 frames per second. Everything is at half native resolution, like that non-Retina native. High settings again. Very impressive given the amount of translation layers we're going through here, right? It's not as much as like crossover where you have Vulkan to Metal in the mix as well. It is directly from DirectX to Metal. But the fact that we have these complex DirectX 12 games running through both Rosetta and the GPU translation layer at the same time, it's remarkable, honestly. Like that you can do real-time stuff that goes through so much translation. It's exciting to me.
Yeah, it's really impressive. You also, I believe, tested Hogwarts Legacy and
that's DirectX 12 as well.
maybe.
Yeah, so Hogwarts Legacy honestly runs better on my Apple Silicon MacBook than it does on my iMac, which is a 2020 with a Core i7 10700K and a Radeon RX 5700 XT, which it's incredible, right? So the one major difference is that on my laptop, I ran it at non-Retina native, just straight.
Right.
On my iMac, I have it set to display resolution of 4K, but with internal render resolution of 1080p, using FSR to scale it back up, and that does have a performance cost.
Right.
But on my laptop, I was seeing consistently like 6 FPS more than on my desktop at the settings I play at, which is basically everything at ultra at that resolution. So we landed at like, for 38, 40-esque FPS, I think.
Nice.
Very impressive to me. That wasn't in a small like dungeon area. I didn't actually test the outside world. So it might drop if you like go flying in the outer world. Didn't test that.
Right.
Alan Wake Remastered. Everything set to high, same resolution, 50 FPS-ish. Very playable.
Nice.
I say that even though it is like a remastered version, they haven't upgraded the graphics that much. Like they probably have. If I look at them side by side, I'd be like, wow, the original looked that old. Like, you know, things date more in real world than they do in your memory. Or age, but
they really do.
Yeah, like it looked worse than I remember it, but the original probably looks way worse than I remember.
So it's funny how that works. I've done that in some games this year, last year. I go back and I'm like, I thought this looked better.
Exactly. Yeah.
A few quick, just seeing as we're talking about some of these games, Sam had posted a chart from Dave2D. Honestly, I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, that guy. He's a YouTube big chart.
Yeah, must be a YouTuber.
He does great stuff.
So we tested Cyberpunk 2077, Diablo 4, Elden Ring, Spider-Man. There's a bunch of them, so I don't know which one that was. Horizon Zero Dawn and Hogwarts Legacy. So the interesting, and he tested them on 4 different computers, 14-inch MacBook Pro M2 Max, an M2 MacBook Air, an M1 MacBook Air, and a Mac Studio M1 Ultra. So the M1 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Air were all pretty low end. The M1 is basically out of the running. It's like 15. nothing even broke 20 FPS on any of these games, which isn't playable. Like honestly,
well, actually, I think something important to notice here is at least like with the Medium, which was one that has a Mac native title in the works, right?
Yes.
In one of the WWDC keynotes, Apple showed at least a doubling of performance from the game porting toolkit to the native version.
Right. Yeah.
And for all the M1 MacBook Air results in the Dave2D chart, if you double the frame rate, you get at least 30 frames per second for
Absolutely.
a MacBook Air M1.
It's true, and in some cases you'd hit like 35, 40.
Yes.
I found in the past, at least, of course, this is all subjective to personal like gamer preference, but I can't remember the game, but I played something like at a steady 25, 28, like very like it doesn't move. And you don't really notice a difference. Some people claim, though, if it's not 60 FPS or 120 FPS, it's garbage and unplayable. So it's like, what are your eyes used to? What kind of monitor do you have? Basically, like, what's an acceptable gaming experience for you? The level of the textures, the draw distance, the FPS rate, like, I think Mac gamers,
I think what you say there about the monitor is also an important point, because obviously with my MacBook Pro, I was testing all of this with the ProMotion display that can like adaptively change its refresh rate to match the frame rate, right?
Yeah.
And I'd say that like something like 38 FPS or something in that range, right, looked significantly better on that display than it does on my iMac at a similar frame rate, because every single frame the GPU sends to the display gets displayed, whereas with like 30 FPS on a 60 hertz monitor, there's like this, not what do you call it? Like there's a term from like film projectors where they do so some frames are repeated and some are not, right? To match up the frame rate and the display.
Right.
But with every frame actually being presented on the display, it feels smoother than it does on a non-adaptive frame rate display at any given resolution.
It's true, it does. So that is a factor. And it's key what you said also, that the chart I was just mentioning from Dave2D, this is the beta 1 porting toolkit, zero optimization. So on the lower end, it's not promising. But yeah, if you double those numbers, which is very reasonable, you're completely playable. And what's interesting is on the M2 Mac, MacBook Pro M2 Max, and the M1 Ultra Mac Studio, the frame rate's already great. I think the lowest one is like 40 FPS, and on the M1 Ultra, they jump up to like 60, 70, 97 in one case, Diablo 4. What I did find funny was on Elden Ring for the M2 Max and the M1 Ultra, they're the same, 60 FPS. I don't know if that was like a locking thing.
That's a locking thing.
That's what I thought, okay. Because then we have some pretty big discrepancies, like Cyberpunk on the M2 Max, 40 FPS. On the M1 Ultra, 71 FPS. You know, like big difference there. But
yeah, but again, like going back to the whole thing with this as being a developer preview 1, some people with the Ultra chips have reported like horrendous frame rates. Like, well, we're talking 10 FPS. Because something goes wrong with the whole Ultra Fusion thing and the beta preview. So it just doesn't utilize like it just doesn't work very well. I think I've only heard people report this for the Ultra chips and no other chip, but it might just be a generic thing that happens on any like thing with this bug. I don't know, but that's something to keep in mind. You know, some things might just fall through the floor.
For sure. Yeah. What I'm most interested in, though, is not these higher ends, not the M2 Max, not the M1 Ultra, and not even the M1 MacBook Air, though that's, like you said, if that doubles, that's impressive. To me, once again, talking about baseline, and this is always our like the through line point of this whole silicon thing since it was announced. What's the floor of Mac gaming performance, like year by year as it climbs? So the M2 MacBook Air is going to become the new floor eventually, like more or less. There were the M2 chip, because the M1 is already 2-3 years old, you know. So the Mac, and on this unoptimized chart, the M2 chip is putting out like close to that 30 FPS across a lot of these big games, or not far off.
And what I think is
impressive to me.
I also think it's particularly interesting, like how the M2 performs relative to the M1 in different games, because there's major differences, right? Like some games are almost like a doubling, while other games it's just like, I don't know, 10% more.
Yeah, for sure.
Doing like off the top of my head percentage math is probably wrong, but yeah, it's big versus small differences across the different games tested.
Yeah. So of course, and this is a developer question I don't know the answer to. Maybe you could comment. So like, you know, say you're a Windows dev, you know, okay, well, if you're Blizzard, you'll probably put all the energy into like optimizing it across the board. But say you're double A dev, or you're an indie dev or whatever, like, you know, how hard is it to optimize it per silicon range? M1, M2, M2 Max, M2 Pro, whatever, M1 Ultra, like, is there like some sort of middle level optimization you could do, you know, or do you have to like really fine tune it? You know, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, some optimizations are gonna be better just across the board. Like no matter what hardware it runs on, basically, right? And you're gonna do that, you know, for your game, because it's gonna affect the PC port, it's gonna affect the Mac port, it's gonna affect the PlayStation port if you make that, whatever, all of your versions. Some optimizations are gonna be specific to the software platform you're targeting. That is Metal versus DirectX versus whatever, Windows, Linux, macOS. This might be focused, like I would say, significantly less on for a smaller market share operating system like macOS. Some things are going to be hardware architecture specific. And by that, I'm like saying something like ARM versus Intel, or on the GPU side, immediate mode rendering versus tile-based deferred rendering, which are like the difference between your traditional AMD or NVIDIA GPUs and Apple Silicon's GPU architecture.
Right.
For this, some of it can be very. It's very variable how much work you need to put into it to get big or small gains out of it on that front. For some things, it's going to almost be automatic, like almost automatic, and you just win, 20% performance on making a very tiny change. And that's going to happen, right? That they're going to take the easy wins. For other things, you're going to have to like hyper specialize on each individual hardware configuration. And frankly, unless Apple is sponsoring your game, I don't think you're going to get something that's like hyper focused on a specific generation of Apple Silicon, or like, hyper optimized for every single Apple Silicon generation. It may be like, if you're talking about some indie studio or something, just from their testing, they do like a tiny performance win on the machine that they happen to have, and that also affects all other machines of the same generation of GPU or something. Just because you can't optimize for hardware you don't have unless it's some generic optimization, right? It's difficult to test for. At least you can try and optimize based on, well, I know it has this many cores or whatever. But
yeah, Apple sponsored, or someone like Ferrell, who traditionally, at least with Intel, has put in the legwork to like fine tune it across the range. With Ferrell being so quiet, and like a correction. When we were talking about Grid Legends last episode, and Sam was like, "Oh, they just put out an article." That article was from 2022, June 6th,
it was a year,
not 2023. I didn't catch that until after the show, and then I posted on Discord. So they announced the game a year ago, still made no particular showing at WWDC. I don't think it was there at all, unless there was like collage of like games flying around at one point. I don't know if one of them was like Grid Legends, but
no, but they did not that long ago put out a YouTube video about some Warhammer. I don't know if it was an expansion or a new game or something that was coming to macOS.
Okay, interesting. I didn't catch that. Well, there's always more Warhammer DLC being released. Like,
it was probably a DLC. It sounded like a DLC.
There is a new Warhammer game coming. I think it's set in. Oh my goodness, it might be set in Egypt or something. I forget the name of it. But seeing as Ferrell did do Warhammer 3, it's probably the next like mini DLC pack, a couple new lords and commanders and mini missions.
I think it was a Total War Warhammer thing. Not
most likely that. But the baseline floor is what I'm most excited about. Of course, the M1s are still the bulk of the M1 chip, whatever the range is. M1 or M1 Max, Pro, whatever it is, Ultras. Are still the dominant range because they've been out. But say a year or two from now, which is when we'll probably really start seeing the results of this game porting kit anyway, the saturation of M2s will be much stronger. Just the baseline M2, no fancy upgrades.
Yeah, but you also have things like Metal FX resolution upscaling, which I think is going to be like a massive win here, just across the board. Like,
well, it's akin to like DLSS kind of.
Yeah,
right?
it's akin to DLSS, AMD FSR, Intel XeSS. There's resolutions or technologies like this popping up all over the gaming sphere. Like, there's also an internal one to PlayStation that's just, it's been there. No, right. I don't think it has a code name. It's just whatever PlayStation does.
Right.
But this allows you to render the game at a low resolution, and it'll look like a higher resolution effectively. Like, there's going to be some loss, but less than if you just rendered it flat at that resolution. Which means that, all of the testing we've looked at so far has been aiming like around that 1080p level, full HD. But let's say, a year, 2, 3 from now, you're looking at your MacBook Air M1 and you're like, darn it, it only gets, 27 frames per second, and I want at least 30 for whatever new game at that point. Maybe you can use Metal FX upscaling to lower it to 720p, and it'll still look kinda-ish 1080p with Metal FX, and it'll run at 30 FPS.
That's true.
It's not a golden bullet. You're not going to be able to play games just forever by lowering the effective render resolution, and it's still looking like 1080p forever, right? But it is definitely going to help across the board, right? Not just the low end, but the high end as well. You can sit there with an 8K display and effectively render at 4K, and it'll look better as well.
It's true. Yeah. No, it's definitely been, as far as I understand, in the PC gaming world at least, a pretty big upgrade, like DLSS, the NVIDIA one. I've definitely noticed a difference using it on my PC. Cyberpunk 2077, Warhammer Darktide, 40K. Like you get a pretty big FPS jump when you turn it on or off, and the game still looks fantastic. You don't really notice.
Definitely.
At least, okay, to be fair, I have a very powerful PC, a 3080 Ti GPU and all that. But so I guess I don't know if you would notice it more going from like kind of lower to medium, because I'm already running everything at like ultra 4K anyway. Maybe it's less noticeable, but I still think that's important, because anything that extends kind of the life of your gaming machine, I think is important, even by like a year. So you can get, I want to play the latest games, kind of starting to drop below, like you said, that 30 mark. Maybe it's 25 or 28. Tech like this could, give a year or two, even depending on the kind of games you play, could extend the life of it before you feel compelled, like, okay, I really got to buy a new machine or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, like, when I play Hogwarts Legacy on my iMac, as I said, I have the display resolution set to 4K, but I use FSR, AMD's equivalent to this technology, to render the game at 1080p. And I'm sure it would look better at native 4K. But frankly, there's time where you're like, holy crap, this is like the GPU is rendering this at 1080p and it looks this good. Because it really does look incredible, given that the internal render resolution is, a quarter of the pixel count that you're actually looking at.
Yeah.
But it looks sharp as 4K, especially on like, things that aren't moving at incredible speed. Like the faster something moves, the harder it is to do this, mapping from a lower resolution to a higher resolution. But then on the other hand of that, the blur of something moving fast and the fact that you can't focus on it as much means that it is less important that it is as sharp, right?
Right.
So it almost works in tandem with something like motion blur as well to like sell the effect more.
Yeah. It's impressive stuff. It's similar to how, like, I don't know, like the iPhone cameras are always getting better, but I think software is doing a lot of the heavy lifting these days.
Yeah, definitely. There's a massive difference from that picture actually taken by the camera to what you see after processing.
Yeah. So, I mean,
they talked about that deep fusion of the images in the past, where they like take 9 different pictures and combine them into one good picture and stuff, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of software tricks that you can use to make something look better than it technically is before post-processing.
Right.
So yeah. Speaking of like techniques like that, the Vision Pro headset that I mentioned I wasn't that interested in, but I'm going to talk about anyway. Uses what's it called, like foveal rendering, where like it uses the eye tracking thing to notice where you're looking at, renders the point you're looking at extremely high resolution, and your peripheral vision at a lower resolution to save on compute resources. It's just a really cool technology, and like the PlayStation VR headset uses this technology as well. And people who have tested it have been like, I cannot notice. I just really don't notice, because your peripheral vision is just a lot worse than your central vision.
It's
right?
already kind of blurred anyway, almost like, what do they call it, depth of field? Like in the games, you kind of zoom in and you're really focused here, and the edges are a little blurry. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
But since you're looking wherever you're looking, you don't really notice it. Yeah, that's really cool. This is an adjacent topic. It's really like this is like game porting kit speculation in the future. Yeah. So speculation is in like, so one of the main issues facing Mac game porting traditionally, say for game porting houses, Aspire, Feral, what have you, or so not sponsored, so they wanted to bring a game to Mac. I'm talking AAA. This is the category AAA. Licensing was always very prohibitive. This is the reason we never got the latest Call of Duty on Mac. From Aspire, for example, it was always 2 to 3 like generations of game back. They actually told me the numbers like 10 years ago when I didn't work for them as a contract worker, but they told me a bunch of cool stuff. And I'm pretty sure, I can't remember the number exactly, so I don't want to like say it and get it wrong, but the licensing, whatever it was like really expensive. Remember, relative to the Mac gaming space. So say it was reverse. Say you were going to bring a game from like console to PC, and you're like, okay, this license, it's going to cost you $100,000. You're like, who cares? I'm going to be selling to millions of PC gamers, right? Assuming it's a big popular title. Like say, someone wants to license God of War to PC. No brainer. Everyone's going to buy it. Like it's like a shoe-in.
Mm-hmm.
But say you're a Mac studio, a Mac porting house, Feral Aspire, what have you. You're like, oh, well, Activision, back then when they were just Activision, I think still, Activision is going to charge me $100,000 to bring the latest Call of Duty to Mac. Well, your audience is way smaller. Are you really going to make up that revenue and sales? Not to mention, that's just the licensing. What to speak of all your own internal costs to develop the game, and who knows how many hundreds of, developer hours and tuning and support, and like, let's just say it could cost a couple $100,000, maybe half a million. I don't even know, like, to bring the game to Mac. So it's like, and if I recall, the numbers were that high, 50, 100K, or maybe even more for the license from Activision, for the latest one. It was just prohibitive. Prohibitive is the word. So what I'm wondering is, with stuff like GPT, Game Porting Toolkit, not that licensing will go down, but will, more developers support their own stuff. But then the key question is, will they bother to do it concurrently? Will they do it shortly after? Like, okay, release the PC, we'll do it with the Mac 1 month later, 2 weeks later, I don't know, 3 months, like within a 3-month window. I'm very curious about that. Or is it going to be like, oh, we'll do it a year or two later? Like Hideo Kojima, he's like, okay, I'm going to bring all my future titles to Mac, which currently we know they're working on Death Stranding 2. So I'm very curious to see the development of that game. Is it going to be, console PC release, Mac later, Mac very soon, 2 weeks later, same day release? I'm really curious over time. I don't mean right away, because this tech has to develop, has to saturate the market and sort of the interested parties on the PC side. And will that have a snowball effect of, like, again, get a couple more heavy hitters? Maybe Blizzard steps in, maybe Bethesda steps in with like Diablo 4 or Starfield or something. That'd be insane. But then this kind of, that snowball effect. Oh, these other big guys are stepping in. Maybe, our kind of quote unquote sure hits type of games, like basically no risk, because it's big, it's popular. Again, everyone, quote unquote, relatively, everyone will play it. Mass appeal type of games,
So if I were to speculate on this front, what I would say is, if you saw, I posted at some point not too long ago in our chat, a picture from like the subscribers on the Apple gaming subreddit, the trend for that, and like after, like, from the point of the Apple Silicon transition, there was a steady trend upwards for more and more subscribers, right? And then after WWDC, with the announcement of the Game Porting Toolkit, the slope of the curve just skyrocketed. It's not that the overall quantity had increased that much at the point of where I had the graph, but the slope it's basically going straight up.
It looks like it jumped by around 5 or 10,000 subscribers, roughly.
Yeah, and that was like, I forgot what that was, like a week after Dub, right? So it's just gonna, presumably increase from that point onwards. So I think the goal here from Apple's perspective is to jazz up everyone's excitement around this, have coverage like you and me and the entire Mac gaming space, and draw in excitement from the PC crowd as well, going like, oh, actually that's quite kind of interesting over there. And then we're gonna see some studios go, well, let's give it a go, we'll try it, we'll punt it, see what happens. And based on how successful that initial early beginning of developers in-house going, let's give this Mac thing a go, based on how successful that is, it can go either way. If they actually see, oh, there is actually a Mac market for games, then I do think we're going to see massive interest in doing in-house ports of games, not outsourcing as much anymore. It's just going to be taken in-house, and maybe happen simultaneously to PC or console releases as well, depending on how successful it is.
Right.
If there's less interest but still enough to justify it, it's going to be, a month, 2 months, 3 months, half a year after release, still delayed launches, maybe still in-house, maybe not. And if the interest is not there at all, which I obviously hope it is, then Mac gaming space isn't going to change that much after all. But
right.
Those are like the outcomes I see happening. So it's going to be an important early beginning here, but it's going to be hopefully something that evolves into something big.
Right. It definitely has all the framework and foundation to do it. It's just a matter of, okay, will the people in the positions to do something about it, both on, like, say, Apple's side and the PC devs and so on, what do they do with all this? Does Apple keep up the support, keep adding features to the porting kit, and really make basically onboard people with that? And I'm kind of curious, a little bit adjacent, kind of mirroring almost something like the Epic Games Store, who still is like paying for exclusive games and giving away free games. They've slowed it down, but they're still doing it to try and compete with Steam. So basically, how long will Apple keep doing this? Now, we all know they have unlimited money for all intents and purposes, but that's not the point, because in businesses, a given division or arm has to eventually justify itself, with like revenue and what have you. So it doesn't matter that Apple makes billions and trillions, like the gaming arm and all this effort eventually has to pay off, or they will drop it. That's just more or less the way any business works. So the response so far has been great. Hideo Kojima's the man, and I love that his little like anecdote is he's always loved Macs, and he had like an Apple II or whatever way back in the day, and it's kind of like been his dream to always bring games to Mac. And I'm like, what? Why have I never heard this before? That's wild, So I'm kind of curious, like, are there more people like him out there? He is an oddball, like we talked about. He's his own kind of like special entity who could make things happen that maybe other studios or whatever couldn't. But the promise is there, and I'm also curious. The in-house ports have been like, the last couple I can think of were something like Borderlands 3, which was in early 2020, maybe. I think January 2020 or something. The port wasn't very good, but it's the only way we got the game, an internal port.
Yeah, for that one, I almost wished it would have been a Feral or something instead, because
it was pretty rough. But at least we have the game. Something like Dying Light also was internally done. Very wonky port, ran really well on certain hardware.
The sequel, at least so far, didn't get a port.
Someone somewhere said it was supposed to, I think even from the company, but that was like a year or two before it released.
But the first release runs really well, and even on Apple Silicon has, I don't know if it's native actually, but it runs really well on both Apple Silicon and
so it's still like this random, sometimes we get sequels, sometimes we don't, sometimes we get entry 1 in a game, sometimes 1 and 2 and skipped and we get 3, and it's kind of all over the map. So I'm just hoping to see some consistency. It doesn't need to be quantity. I don't need 10 20 new Mac games a year. New Mac games as in like ports. It's just like, can we get a couple consistent ports that run well reasonably, aren't like 5 or 10-year-old games, and and so on and so forth. Like, just let's get some stepping stones. That would be really encouraging to me. And just slowly ramp it up. I would love to see that. Feral, I guess, the other speculation is someone like Feral, I guess we already talked about this a little bit 2 shows ago, maybe, like, are they going to kind of go out of business and extinct as a result of this, or will they always have a place? I think your opinion was like, as they're so specialized, they probably always have some sort of spot in the market.
I think they'll always have some market. The market might change. They work a lot with like the higher end games on Mac at this point. If a lot of the higher end games choose to take their ports in house, Feral might go more of a quantity route and work with more mid tier developers, like the AA kind of games. And bring twice as many but smaller games to the Mac or whatever. But I think that there's always going to be, or maybe they're just going to like act as consultancies houses, right? Where these big AAA studios want to bring their game to Mac. They have a department in house that's going to work on it, but then they get an employee from Feral as a consultant to help them on the Mac special case, right?
Almost like a liaison, or
something like that.
And in addition, additionally, and this is sort of adjacent, and I'm curious because apparently, by all accounts, long ago, 10 odd years ago, Gabe Newell of Valve, head of Valve, owner of Steam, and so on. If people don't pay attention to names and companies, they were, at least according to Gabe Newell's account, they were the ones always pushing Apple in the past, like to do something about Mac gaming. And this was even earlier, more than 10 years ago. This was like 2010, 2011, I think. They released Portal 2 and Team Fortress 2. And Left 4 Dead 2, I think. It was those 3. It was like the orange box or whatever. Counter-Strike and all that jazz on the Mac, and it was a big ta-da. And there's still great games even today, although I think they're all 32-bit. But again, continuing sort of this theory thing and onboarding, like, will Valve bother to kind of do? Of course, they haven't made a game in ages, other than I guess, well, CS:GO already runs on Mac. Dota 2 already runs on Mac, and they've kept up with the upgraded engines and everything. Source 2 is coming though, so we'll see about that. But yeah, I guess my question is, like, will Valve try and do anything with all this the way they used to, or have they kind of been burned by Apple's former?
So I think there's a lot of interesting things to unpack on this aspect. One is that the Steam client, over the past few beta updates to the Steam client, has been getting significantly better on the Mac. For a long time, it didn't support hardware accelerated scrolling, and I don't know if you've noticed, but if you scroll on Steam, it is laggy and annoying. That is fixed in the more recent client betas. The UI is getting an overhaul. Parts of it are going to be more Mac native, like the notifications are going to be placed properly among like the top right corner and stuff to make it feel more Mac native and stuff. So there's at least some work to make it like integrate better with the OS and feel. Then I don't know. Do you remember? I think this was like WWDC 2017 when they released the iMac Pro. They also talked about VR back then and how the iMac Pro could run VR headsets like the Oculus Rift and stuff.
Yeah.
Valve was present for that, and coincided the release of that with the Valve. What is it called? Like, is it just called Steam VR?
Valve Index is their actual hardware.
Not the hardware, the software from. I think it's called Steam VR.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So they released Steam VR for Mac, because prior to that it didn't run on Mac OS. That got cut. I can't remember when, but you can't use the full proper Steam VR on Mac OS right now, even if you have the headset. And I don't know if they're gonna bring that back. I hope they will, given that Apple is now also pushing into the VR space and stuff, right? But that got kicked. And then there's been these stories in the past where Valve had talked about, or at least employees from Valve, or I don't know where I've heard the stories, but definitely people from Valve had teams from Apple come to them and go like, what can we do to make gaming better on the Mac? Asking Valve that, right? In a boardroom meeting or something.
Yeah.
And Valve going, well, to make it work, we'd need this, and this. Then the Apple employees leave, and then 6 months later, a team from Apple comes and goes, what can we do to make gaming on the Mac better? And Valve goes, well, you could do the 3 things we mentioned last time. And the employees go, what 3 things? We don't know what you're talking about. Were we here before? And like, Valve gets frustrated with this and eventually didn't really care to talk about it anymore, right?
Yeah.
But now that Apple is pushing actually towards gaming on the Mac, that might change, and Valve might like reinitialize some of that conversation with Apple, because Valve themselves have a great interest in diversifying the platforms games can run on. Like, not as in the platform as in Steam is the platform. That's what they want. But as in Windows, Linux, Mac OS, right? If Steam can get to a point, or Valve can get to a point where people think about, well, you game on Steam rather than you game on a Mac or on a PC or Linux or whatever. That's the end goal ultimately, right? And that's from their perspective. And that's why something like the Steam Deck or the Steam machines were Linux machines, but they wanted you to just think of the experience as Steam, with Steam Big Picture and the deck experience and all that. They don't want a situation where they're beholden to Microsoft, or if Microsoft suddenly goes, well, the Windows is locked down and you can only install from the Microsoft Store, the Windows Store thing. Like, they're not going to do that, but it is a risk to Valve that exists as long as they are tied up to any given platform. So they want to diversify the space in which you can play games. So they definitely have an interest there, but yeah, I don't know if they're going to push in that direction. But I hope so.
I hope so. I mean, they've, I'm just hoping they will be like, kind of let bygones be bygones. Like, okay, be burned by Apple and their, for lack of a better word, incompetence in Mac gaming. But hopefully Valve was like, okay, cool. They're serious now, seemingly, and they've actually got like other serious devs on board and yada, yada, yada. So we'll see where that goes. But as you said, the fact that Steam is also getting better in terms of like, the hardware acceleration and better UI and native like notifications and so on is just nice. Someone at Valve still cares in their apparently like unusual corporate like open structure where like no one's really in charge and whatever.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting to look at like the difference between company histories here, because when Google announced that whole Stadia thing that is no more, people even when they announced Stadia, people were like, when are they gonna drop this one? Because Google has a history of announcing a cool idea and then going, well, that didn't work, we'll drop it, right? I'd say historically, when Apple announces something publicly, they're more likely to stick with it for a long time, not forever. There does come a point where they're like, well, this didn't work out, drop it. But they are way more likely to give it a fair shot and not just go within a year, didn't pay off, kill it, but go, well, what if we push even harder, maybe next year? So I do think that's also sort of a positive thing in this realm of gaming, that from Apple's perspective, given their track record, even if it doesn't turn out to work as fast as they expect, I don't think they're going to drop the initiative as quickly as someone like Google might.
For sure. That's true.
Or an entity like Google, and not a someone.
No,
but
right, yeah. No, that's fair. History and sort of mood, intent, reputation, whatever you want to call it on these kinds of things is definitely a factor and definitely important, like from the consumer perspective.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like, no one ever took Stadia, whatever, seriously, in my opinion. I mean, I tested it. I have oddly good luck into getting into betas throughout my like gaming stuff for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've gotten into like every single one I've signed up for. Like early level stuff, just whatever, I'm lucky. And it was very impressive. I just launched my Google browser and I jumped into Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I'm like, this is cool as hell. And they even gave me a free copy of Odyssey for testing it. So I'm like, thanks, guys. But I was heavily using GeForce Now at the time, and it was honestly as good and super convenient out of the browser. But minor not this like really quick side snippet, because my love of NVIDIA GeForce Now. Is they've got an even extra deal now with Microsoft. They're going to bring the PC Game Pass select titles to GeForce Now, so it's just more library expansion.
Cool.
So they're supposed, and then separately, they're supposed to be bringing Microsoft Store games to GeForce Now, which I don't think has happened yet.
Okay.
But the games go weirdly Xbox, or it's like the Xbox PC Game Pass. The whole naming thing's confusing to me.
Yeah.
But it's already its own separate streaming service. But if you use that right now on a PC, you stream the console version, at least in my experience, and it's terrible.
Yep.
But I believe the difference is with the PC Game Pass, you can actually download the game to your computer and play it, or stream it. But if you download it, I believe in like 99% of cases, it's the actual PC version.
No, it is. It's in all cases.
Right. Okay. All cases. There we go. So if you want a pure stream, it's a downgrade, but if you want to actually download it, it's an upgrade. But I think it's really interesting. Like, my hope is, and this is something I thought of perhaps even years ago, like, can there be like one almost global platform? Like, I could just log into NVIDIA GeForce Now and practically play anything, like anything bit major from like, dozens of different major studios and platforms, and like, that would be cool. And it really seems like NVIDIA's, they're not there, but they're getting there with all the deals they're making. I mean, the deals have a time limit. I think they're like 10-year deals or something. That's still a long time in the life of gaming. I just think it's cool. Hasn't happened yet, but the deal's made, and I don't know if it has a date, but it's like coming. So just more good news for the NVIDIA GeForce Now streaming stuff. So that's cool.
Yeah, it does present the problem for like game history and archives and stuff. Like, I recently saw a video where someone took Dark Souls 1 and pointed out the differences from the unpatched released version and the fully patched final version of the game after they didn't patch it anymore, right? And they could take their PlayStation 3 disc of the game, put it on their console, turn off the internet, and play the unpatched release version.
Right.
I sort of find it a little bit sad that that's not exactly at least an easy option anymore in the modern day of gaming, and that we're gonna end up in a situation where in 10, 20, 30 years, the games that we like now Like, forget playing an unpatched version. Can you play them at all? Is it just like even emulators, old hardware? Do they work without internet? Like, at what point are we just losing
No, it's true.
access?
There's this what do you call it? Like cross-section integration merging at some point of like tech and release, like how the publisher developer, how they decide to release that to the consumer, how they access it, how they can play it, how granular is your access, how modular, can you mod it, can you tinker with it, or is like here's the game we want you to play and that's all you get. And you're going to play it how we want you to.
There's some games where when you buy the console disc version, the disc version is basically just an unlock key that goes and downloads it from the web servers, right?
Right. Yeah.
If those servers aren't there anymore at some point, then the disc also doesn't have the game. You just can't get it. It's
true. No, that's true, and that's where piracy, as it were, has a force for good in that it's like a catalog, it's an archive, if you will, because these things are saved locally and cracked to run without internet and yada yada yada. In some cases, they even have like latest patch updates of the games. So in that sense, they're not just like scumbag freebooters who want to rip off games. In some cases, like they're just anti-DRM, anti, how you call it? Yeah, like always online and all this kind of stuff. And I don't fault a certain segment of gamers for being annoyed by that stuff and wanting a way around it. Or in some cases, how a pirated version is actually a better experience than the paid one because it avoids all the like de novo DRM crap that like invades your computer. And
that actually reminds me to play Elden Ring on the Apple Gaming porting toolkit thing, right? You have to disable DRM because it uses easy anti-cheat, and that doesn't work with these sort of things, right? And I love what FromSoft have done here, because all you need to do to disable their easy anti-cheat DRM is to rename the file, and then you can just open it. But they know this; it's not unintended. This is intended behavior. Because if you rename the file and go, I don't want easy anti-cheat, I don't want this, then you also can't play online. So they have like this compromise where it's like, if you don't like it, you can turn it off. But we also don't want cheaters. So yeah.
Sure, with the invader mode and whatever. That's good. Yeah. That's good. Now, there should be reasonable compromise options for whatever experience you want. Like, that's fair. I'm slightly less concerned about that, probably because I don't really play old games anymore the way I used to. I used to play a lot of older games and replay them. And now just the way my gaming habits and taste have changed, I tend to focus on not always Call to the New, but probably games within the last like 3 years, maybe max 5, and it kind of caps out. And part of that is because I often play certain big releases in a given year. But sometimes I'm just like, well, I only have so much time for gaming, and I probably want something like, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, new and cool, or maybe something with a fresh mechanic or the theme I haven't explored before. Not to say older games are all like the same or have nothing cool to offer, but in some cases, I've already played it, A, or B, maybe there's a reasonably equivalent game, but that it's like 5 or 10 years newer, and it's like, well, I'm just going to play that because maybe it looks better, or maybe it has some slightly less clunky UI or whatever it is. I'm not trying to invalidate anyone who is concerned about this. I think it's a really legitimate point of view to have, especially just never mind games, software in general, like software archiving, not just games, like all apps. I think that's I agree that's important. I'm just personally not as invested in it. And it's not because I think it's unimportant. It's just kind of my gaming tech lifestyle is very sort of cloud-based. In the now, a lot of my like web work and coding, and not that I don't have local backups. It's just the way I've gone. But I completely respect and even encourage these other views because I also think they're an important part of the picture. And if they didn't exist at all, I think publishers might even push like DRM and always online even harder. So I think that there is a segment of the app, gaming, whatever, who pushed back against this and is vocal about it. I'm actually grateful to them, because I don't have to put the energy into being vocal about it. So I think it's very good. And there should be a balance, a middle road, if you were, to most of these things. And like that.
As like a final remark, because I don't have too much more time. But as a final remark before we go, and then we can cover a lot of other things that we did in a later episode. I just want to say, like, I also tested, as you mentioned earlier, I think Dragon Ball Kakarot and Elix on the porting toolkit. Elix being a game where the sequel is getting a Mac port, as we've talked about before. So I thought it would be cool to test the original Elix and see how that runs, because you might want to get like the full picture of the story before you play the second. So it would be an opportunity to play it that way. Now, unfortunately, I found through those that there is a memory leak in Apple's porting toolkit in this early preview, which means that the exact usage here varies depending on the game, but on some games, I've only seen this in DirectX 11 titles, but as you play, it just keeps eating more and more memory. Now, I have 32 gigabytes of memory in my MacBook, and if I play Dragon Ball Z Kakarot for, let's say, around 15 minutes, the frame rate goes from a locked 60 to about 2 FPS.
Wow.
Because you run out of memory, and then it needs to, instead of having fast VRAM, it needs to talk to the SSD. And there's a pretty big difference between 400 gigabytes per second and 5 gigabytes per second.
Right.
So that's rather unfortunate. I hope and assume it's going to be fixed in one of the, upcoming betas of the toolkit. But that is something to keep in mind. And Apple might not even see it as a priority to fix it, given that, if a developer is using this just to estimate what kind of frame rate they might get in a native port, they might just go like, well, you have 15 minutes before you need to restart it. Isn't that's plenty?
Right.
You can see it runs at 16.
Memory leaks are insidious, though. In some cases, they're slower, at least in smaller games. I can't remember which ones. I played one or two that had them, and you have to play for a couple hours, but then it's like, it's not like 15 minutes. It's interesting. And I would hope they fix it so some devs don't go like, well, I can't even test this, because I need more time. Maybe the game's really complex, or you have to test a lot of different areas or mechanics or something. I don't know. Yeah. And they're like, well, it's too much of a headache. And
I mean, I'm certain they're gonna, want to fix it, but the question is just like how high up on the priority list.
Right. For sure.
And I also want to point out that I also tested Batman Arkham Knight, which I think that's DirectX 10 or 11. It's one of the two. It runs weirdly, because all of the games I tested were to some degree CPU bottlenecked. Batman Arkham Knight is very CPU bottlenecked. That is to say, sometimes you're running at 120 frames per second, the refresh rate of the monitor, full half native resolution, all settings at max, 120 FPS. And then you do some animation. Like you pull out a batarang or something, and it drops to 18 in an instance, right? And that's what I was talking about before. Like a solid 30 is way better than fluctuations this great, right? Because the game runs perfectly smoothly. Rain, like the whole visual scene of just looking out over the city, perfect. But as soon as you do anything, I think it might be relating to the cape physics on Batman or something. And if you look at the metal performance HUD tells you like how long it took the GPU to prepare the frame and how long it took the CPU to prepare the frame. The GPU looks almost, it wouldn't have run at 120 FPS, but the GPU has the frame ready enough to reach 70 plus. The CPU just does not. So I think it's like the physics of the cape or something that the CPU is trying to calculate for or something, and it just...
Well, traditionally, like this hair, clothing, physics, havoc, whatever type stuff has always been frame rate killers when unoptimized or whatever it is. So at least in the past. Nowadays, at least on PC, that's gotten better. But famously, even stuff like Witcher 3 on release, if you enabled like the hair physics, this is 2015, so quite a while ago now, but it was like, I can run it perfectly at ultra, and now I'm tanked to like 10 FPS or something. Yeah.
But again, this is very much something that's going to be improved if you switch from Rosetta 2 to native ARM, but it's something that for some games especially really can hinder the usefulness of the toolkit, and Arkham Knight is one of the ones where it's unplayable, even though the game could run at 120 FPS.
Right, and that's interesting. Right. Yeah, but it's a bold new future, hopefully, and tons of promising stuff. And so here's the thing, just to, again, wrap this up in the next minute or two or whatever. We will get an initial, like, let's just call it wave 1 or gen 1 of attempts at this. That'll happen from more Apple-sponsored stuff, from Kojima, from a couple others maybe unannounced. And there's a pretty big list of games coming already that we talked about 2 shows ago.
There's like
the Elex, Bloober
I know
Team,
of like
all their
12 games I think that are coming to Mac.
Yeah, quite a few.
Yeah,
and most of them are like AA basically, or some indie, some AA. Good range of titles, action, adventure, racing, horror, all that stuff. A solid range. So we'll get
actually super interesting. Lies of P. The demo is only for Windows. I tested it. The porting toolkit, it runs like 45 FPS plus high settings. But Lies of P is coming to Mac natively as well. I don't think we quite. Yeah.
No. And basically it's like Pinocchio Dark Souls kind of.
Yeah, basically. But what's extra cool is I don't know like if this is going to like target future hardware or if they're just going to do it without acceleration cores. But they have said Lies of P on Mac will have ray tracing.
Oh, okay. I was actually going to ask about that. Not specific to this game, but ray tracing on Mac. I don't think any Mac games currently doing it. Maybe some iPad OS or something is doing it.
I don't
Metal
think so.
supports ray tracing.
Yes.
To my knowledge, no. Let's just, for lack of a better word, let's call it I don't hate these. Okay, a non-mobile game. I was going to say real game, but that's, what do you call it? Snobby and asinine, so I'll try to get away from that language. Yeah. And Apple announced ray tracing metal support like years ago.
Yeah, there's also like upgrades yet again to the ray tracing acceleration structures in metal this year, so there is focus on it.
Very interesting.
But the interesting thing is like the M chips and the A chips and all that from Apple. They don't have like dedicated RT cores, but you can use metal ray tracing acceleration structures to some degree accelerate ray tracing operations on the shader cores, like the normal GPU cores in there. It's not at all the same as having dedicated ray tracing hardware, but it is a thing that,
Well, what's interesting with ray tracing itself, well, for one, it does look phenomenal and it does make a difference in your gaming experience, but I've noticed it's become more granular even over the last like 2 years. Like there's ray tracing light settings and like medium and ultra and psycho, and now they're coming out with overdrive. You need the latest 4080 card from NVIDIA, but before it was just kind of like ray tracing on or off. There was no real settings, and now it's getting a lot more granular. So I am hoping, maybe that's like an entry point on the Mac side. Well, it's probably not going to be like super high end ray tracing, but maybe it could be like lower end, which is still even lower end looks really cool. Of ray tracing, honestly.
And that might be like what the Lies of P announcement is, like initial low ray tracing setting on the Mac before we get actual ray tracing acceleration units or something. But I don't know. All I know is that they've said it's a thing that's going to happen in the Mac port. So.
Ooh, really cool. So I can't remember the name of the game. Sorry, I don't like to dunk on people's games, so the game wasn't very good. Okay. We got a Souls-like on Mac. It was that weird sci-fi one. We were on a ship. I played a fair amount of it as a...
actually, I did. Is this Hellpoint?
Yeah, Hellpoint. I think it is. I just don't think the game's very good as a game. I'm sorry.
I didn't enjoy it very much either. My brother recommended it to me at some point where he was like, I found a new Souls-like. He's very into Souls-like games.
Right.
I think it is Hellpoint. It might be something close to that, but it's at least something along those lines.
I'm clicking on it. No, it's Hellpoint.
Yep. And like my brother recommended it. I played a bit and he was like very excited about it. And then like I don't think this is very good in my head, right? And then my brother sends me a message of like, I got a bit further into the game. It's not actually that good. But like, it's cool for like, it's cool they tried. It's cool they did it. And I give the developers a lot of credit for what they have made, even if it wasn't a game I personally found very entertaining.
Yes.
Hats off to them. You did something cool. You made something.
You did. You got, I mean, even making a AA game is a big deal. I mean, honestly, releasing any level of game is a big deal. Like, you put your blood, sweat, and tears and whatever into it, whether you're one person, 10 people, 100 people working on a game, whatever it is, like start to finish, launch, publish, sales, that's all a big deal. And they seem to have done reasonably well. Hats off to them. But as far as like making like, here's a Souls-like game that's like the kind of experience you might expect or want out of a Souls-like game. I think we've yet to have that on the Mac, but I think the Lies of P could deliver that from what I've seen.
From the very early bit I played of the demo through the game porting toolkit, I'll say that it felt like significantly better to me than Hellpoint did. It did not feel as good as a FromSoft game, but it's good.
Right.
Is what it seemed to be. And like it's more in the spirit of something like Bloodborne, I think.
Okay.
And given that Bloodborne never got a PC release as well, like Lies of P could be interesting in that sense as well. It emphasizes aggression more than Souls games would a bit, I think, which Bloodborne did as well. And yeah,
for sure. Yeah, really cool though. Yeah. But yeah, the sort of wrap up point is we'll definitely see this wave 1, maybe even wave 2. So it's just a matter of like, will the waves keep coming?
Yeah.
And just stabilize and just no longer be a wave and just become the new normal. But we can definitely look forward to a bunch of releases we've talked about, a bunch more we don't know about in the next year or two, and then we'll go from there. I'm just really hoping we'll get like Diablo 4 or Starfield or something because I'm a snob. I mean, I've already frankly pre-ordered Starfield after the deep dive the other day. Honestly, I was mad in the game. Like, I don't even care about this game. Then I watched the deep dive and I'm like, oh my God, I need this game. Anyway.
I had mixed feelings on the deep dive. Like on the one hand, there was a lot of really cool things in there. But there was one point where one of the Bethesda employees says something to the effect of, what I love most about Starfield is that it's still through and through a Bethesda game. And I'm sitting there like, that's what concerns me.
Yeah. Like, no. It's true. I agree. And, people have been beaming already because Bethesda said this will be like the least buggy game we've put out. And people are like, well, that's not a high bar to clear.
Exactly. Yeah. And like when they say things like, it's so big and the planets are procedurally generated, I'm like, I don't want procedural generation. I want handcrafted.
I don't either. I agree. I also want handcrafted. It's the same reason I avoided No Man's Sky, even though I was generally attracted to this space exploration adventures type thing. Starfield is at least more of the kind of game I want, like as an experience. I don't want
they have some more handcrafted things in there as well, like the major story point. So I'm the kind of person who'd probably stick to the more like handcrafted stuff and just dabble on some of the side experiences. But I think it does look pretty impressive, and it went from just kind of looking like weird Fallout 4 in space to more like a bit of its own thing. It's still clearly got DNA from Fallout and even some Elder Scrolls things, but definitely the adoring fans in it from Oblivion.
But the deep dive at least established it's doing enough like to give it some of its own identity. Now I'm like, okay, I can then kind of grasp what it is and not just write it off as a kind of a reskin. So pretty cool nonetheless. I've just been craving a space experience for a while. I keep buying like space board games and it hasn't worked out. I like buy, try, sell, buy, try, sell.
Have you played The Outer Worlds?
No, I almost got it several times. It's been on my wish list for a while, and I've watched gameplays and Twitch and everything, but I decided I wanted something a little more freeform maybe and somewhat less sort of companion-y RPG-y, even though Starfield can be that too.
Fair enough, but I highly recommend The Outer Worlds. It has a really fun writing style.
That's what mostly attracted me. I think around when I was thinking of buying it, because there was a big sale, I was like, oh, and then they announced Outer Worlds 2. Of course, that's a ways off. And I'm like, you know what? I think I'll just wait for the second one. I've got games to play already anyway. And that was kind of my decision. Because I do enjoy the, sort of zany, well-written, but like multiple solutions to things. You can kind of be the good guy or the bad guy or whatever.
Yeah.
Not quite immersive sim level, but a half step in that direction anyway. It's good times for sure. But we'll see. Yeah. But basically, a lot to look forward to. Well exceeded our expectations, in my opinion, with all this GPT's game porting kit stuff. Game porting toolkit. So yeah, GPT for short. GPT,
not to be confused with ChatGPT.
That's what I was about to say. Maybe that association in my head. Yeah. You'd have to call it like Mac GPT or Apple GPT or something to maybe sort of sidestep that. Yeah. All right. Probably wrap it up there because there's other games we could talk about in the next show or two. But yeah, we're approaching an hour and a half. So
stay tuned for Pathfinder.
Yeah, there's cool stuff from Owlcat Games, Pathfinder stuff, including their upcoming Rogue Trader game, which I did play for about an hour and a half in the beta. Cool stuff. They don't advertise a Mac beta, but they have one. I will say that much.
That's cool.
Yeah.
But massive excitement in the Mac gaming space.
Yes, much hype, much excitement, and thanks to Casper for all his deep dives and lengthy write-ups and photos been posting on the Discord, exciting me, Sam, and Ted, and probably not Lily so much. She's off in the army, like shooting tanks. She's posting photos from her tank. It's pretty funny, actually. Entertaining us. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Casper, for all your efforts, and glad to hear your comments. Still looking forward to more of your comments, even on maybe some WWDC stuff, but that can wait till next time.
Yeah. Thanks.
A lot to unpack, and thanks for everyone for being here as always, and for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.